Section 6. Book 2, Part 1 of the Histories of Publius Cornelius Tacitus. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Morgan Scorpion. The Histories of Publius Cornelius Tacitus, translated by Alfred John Church and William Jackson Brodrib. Book 2, March to August A.D. 69, Part 1. 2.1. In a distant part of the world fortune was now preparing the origin and rise of a new dynasty, whose varied destinies brought happiness or misery on the state, prosperity or destruction on the princes of its line. Titus Vespasian had been sent from Judea by his father while Galba still lived, and alleged as a reason for his journey the homage due to the emperor, and his age, which now qualified him to compete for office. But the vulgar, ever eager to invent, had spread the report that he was sent for to be adopted. The advanced years and childless condition of the emperor furnished matter for such gossip, and the country never can refrain from naming many persons until one be chosen. The report gained the more credit from the genius of Titus himself, equal as it was to the most exalted fortune, from the mingled beauty and majesty of his countenance, from the prosperous fortunes of Vespasian, from the prophetic responses of oracles, and even from accidental occurrences which, in the general disposition to belief, were accepted as omens. At Corinth, the capital of Achaia, he received positive information on the death of Galba, and found men who spoke confidently of the revolt of Vitellius and of the fact of war. In the anxiety of his mind, he sent a few of his friends, and carefully surveyed his position from both points of view. He considered that if he should proceed to Rome, he should get no thanks for a civility intended for another, while his person would be a hostage in the hands either of Vitellius or of Otho. That he should turn back, the conqueror would certainly be offended, but with the issue of the struggle still doubtful, and the father joining the party, the son would be excused. On the other hand, if Vespasian should assume the direction of the state, men who had to think of war would have to forget such causes of offence. 2.2. These and like thoughts made him waver between hope and fear, but hope triumphed. Some supposed that he retraced his steps for love of Queen Berenice, nor was his young heart averse to her charms, but this affection occasioned no hindrance to action. He passed, it is true, a youth enlivened by pleasure, and practised more self-restraint in his own than in his father's reign. So after coasting Achaia and Asia, leaving the lands on his left, he made for the islands of Rhodes and Cyprus, and then by a bolder course for Syria. Here he conceived a desire to visit and inspect the temple of the Paphian Venus, place of celebrity both among natives and foreigners. It will not be a tedious digression to record briefly the origin of the worship, the ceremonial of the temple, and the form under which the goddess is adored, a form found in no other place. 2.3. The founder of the temple, according to old tradition, was King Arius, though some represent this as the name of the goddess herself. Later accounts tell us that the temple was consecrated by Cinyras, and that the goddess herself after her birth from the sea was wafted to this spot, but that the wisdom and craft of the diviners was a foreign importation introduced by Thamyras of Cilicia, and that it was agreed that the descendants of both families should preside over the worship. Afterwards, that the royal family might not be without some superiority over the foreign stock, the strangers relinquished the craft which they had themselves introduced. The priest of the line of Cinyras is alone consulted. The victims are such as each worshipper has vowed, but males are selected. The surest prognostics are seen in the entrails of kids. It is forbidden to pour blood on the altar. The place of sacrifice is served only with prayers and pure flame, and though it stands in the open air, it is never wet with rain. The image of the goddess does not bear the human shape. It is a rounded mass rising like a cone from a broad base to a small circumference. The meaning of this is doubtful. 2.4. Titus, after surveying the treasures, the royal presents, and the other objects which the antiquarian tendencies of the Greek arbitrarily connect with some uncertain past, first consulted the oracle about his voyage. Receiving an answer that the way was open and the sea propitious, he then, after sacrificing a number of victims, asked some questions in ambiguous phrase concerning himself. Sostratus, that was the name of the priest, seeing that the entrails presented an uniformly favourable appearance, and that the goddess signified her favour to some great enterprise, returned at the moment a brief and ordinary answer, but afterwards soliciting a private interview, disclosed the future. His spirits raised, Titus rejoined his father, and was received as a mighty pledge of success by the wavering minds of the provincials and the troops. Vespasian had all but completed the Jewish war, and only the siege of Jerusalem now remained, an operation, the difficulty and the arduousness of which was due, rather to the character of its mountain citadel and the perverse obstinacy of the national superstition, than to any sufficient means of enduring extremities left to the besieged. As we have mentioned above, Vespasian himself had 3 legions inured to war. Mucianus had 4 under his command in his peaceful province. Emulation, however, and the glory won by the neighbouring army had banished all tendency to sloth, and unbroken rest and exemption from the hardships of war had given them a vigour equivalent to the hardihood which the others had gained by their perils and their toils. Each had auxiliary forces of infantry and cavalry, each had fleets and tributary kings, and each, though their renown was of a different kind, had a celebrated name. 2.5 Vespasian was an energetic soldier. He could march at the head of his army, choose the place for his camp, and bring by night and day his skill, or, if the occasion required, his personal courage to oppose the foe. His food was such as chance offered. His dress and appearance hardly distinguished him from the common soldier. In short, but for his avarice, he was equal to the generals of old. Mucianus, on the contrary, was eminent for his magnificence, for his wealth, and for greatness that transcended in all respects the condition of a subject. Readier of speech than the other, he thoroughly understood the arrangement and direction of civil business. It would have been a rare combination of princely qualities, if, with their respective faults removed, their virtues only could have been united in one man. Mucianus was governor of Syria, Vespasian of Judea. In the administration of these neighbouring provinces jealousy had produced discord between them, but on Nero's fall they had dropped their animosities and associated their counsels. At first they communicated through friends, till Titus, who was the great bond of union between them, by representing their common interests, had terminated their mischievous feud. He was indeed a man formed both by nature and by education to attract even such a character as that of Mucianus. The tribunes, the centurions, and the common soldiers were brought over to the cause by appeals to their energy or their love of license, to their virtues or to their vices, according to their different dispositions. 2.6 Long before the arrival of Titus, both armies had taken the oath of allegiance to Otho. The news had come as usual with great speed, while there was much to delay the gigantic undertaking of a civil war, for which the East, after a long period of repose, was then for the first time preparing. In former times the mightiest civil conflicts had begun in Gaul or Italy with the resources of the West. Pompey, Brutus, Cassius, and Antony, all of whom had been followed across the sea by civil war, had met with a disastrous end, and the emperors had been oftener heard of than seen in Syria and Judea. There had been no mutiny among the legions, nothing indeed but some demonstrations against the Parthians, attended with various success. In the last civil war, though other provinces had been disturbed, peace had been here unshaken. Then had followed a loyal adherence to Galba, but when it became notorious that Otho and Vitellius, opposed in impious strife, were ready to make a spoil of the empire, the thought that others would engross the rewards of power, while they would have nothing left for themselves but a compulsory submission, made the soldiers murmur and take a survey of their own strength. There were close at hand 7 legions. There was Syria and Judea, with a vast number of auxiliaries. Then, without any interval of separation, there was Egypt and its 2 legions. And on the other side, Cappadocia, Pontus, and all the garrisons along the frontier of Armenia. There was Asia Minor, there were the other provinces, not without a military population, and well furnished with money. There were all the islands of the Mediterranean. And there was the sea itself, which during the interval of preparation for war would be both a convenience and a protection. 2.7 The ardour of the troops was not unknown to their generals, but it was judged advisable to wait for the issue of the struggle which others were carrying on. The conquerors and the conquered, it was said, never unite with a genuine good faith. It matters not whether fortune make Otho or Vitellius to be the victor. Even great generals grow insolent in prosperity. These men are quarrelsome, indolent, and profligate, and their own faults will make war fatal to the one and success to the other. They therefore postponed the war until a more fitting opportunity, and though Vespasian and Mucianus had but lately resolved on concerted action, the others had done so long before. The worthiest among them were moved by patriotism. Many were wrought upon by the attractions of plunder, some by their private embarrassments, and so, good and bad, from different motives but with equal zeal, were all eager for war. 2.8. About this time Achaia and Asia Minor were terrified by a false report that Nero was at hand. Various rumours were current about his death, and so there were many who pretended and believed that he was still alive. The adventures and enterprises of the other pretenders I shall relate in the regular course of my work. The pretender in this case was a slave from Pontus, or according to some accounts, a freedman from Italy, a skilful harp player and singer, accomplishments which, added to a resemblance in the face, gave a very deceptive plausibility to his pretensions. After attaching to himself some deserters, needy vagrants whom he bribed with great offers, he put to sea. Driven by stress of weather to the island of Cynthus, he induced certain soldiers, who were on their way from the east, to join him, and ordered others, who refused, to be executed. He also robbed the traders, and armed all but the most able-bodied of the slaves. The centurion Sisenna, who was the bearer of the clasped right hands, the usual emblem of friendship, from the armies of Syria to the Praetorians, were assailed by him with various artifices, till he left the island secretly, and fearing actual violence, made his escape with all haste. Thence the alarm spread far and wide, and many roused themselves at the well-known name, eager for change and detesting the present state of things. The report was daily gaining credit when an accident put an end to it. 2.9. Galba had entrusted the government of Galatia and Pamphylia to Calpurnius Asprenas. 2 triremes from the fleet of Misenum were given him to pursue the adventurer. With these he reached the island of Cynthus. Persons were found to summon the captains in the name of Nero. The pretender himself, assuming a studied appearance of sorrow, and appealing to their fidelity as old soldiers of his own, besought them to land him in Egypt or Syria. The captains, perhaps wavering, perhaps intending to deceive, declared that they must address their soldiers, and that they would return when the minds of all had been prepared. Everything, however, was faithfully reported to Asprenas, and at his bidding the ship was boarded and taken, and the man, whoever he was, killed. The body, which in the eyes, the hair, and the savage countenance were remarkable features, was conveyed to Asia, and thence to Rome. 2.10. In a state that was distracted by strife, and that from frequent changes in its rulers trembled on the verge between liberty and license, even little matters were attended with great excitement. Vibius Crispus, whose wealth, power, and ability made him rank among men of distinction rather than among men of worth, demanded that Annius Faustus, of the equestrian order, who in the days of Nero had practised the trade of the informer, should be brought to trial before the Senate. The Senate indeed had recently, during the reign of Galba, passed a resolution that cognizance should be taken of the cases of the informers. This decree was variously carried out, and while retained as law, was powerless or effectual according as the person who happened to be accused was influential or helpless. Besides the terror of the law, Crispus had exerted his own power to the utmost to destroy the man who had informed against his brother. He had prevailed upon a great part of the Senate to demand that he should be consigned to destruction, undefended and unheard. But on the other hand, there were some with whom nothing helped the accused person so much as the excessive power of the accuser. They gave it as their opinion that time ought to be allowed, that the charges ought to be specified, that, odious and guilty as the man might be, he yet ought to be heard as precedent required. At first they carried their point, and the trial was postponed for a few days, but before long Faustus was condemned, but by no means with that unanimity on the part of the people which his detestable character had deserved. Men remembered that Crispus had followed the same profession with profit, nor was it the penalty but the prosecutor that they disliked. 211. Meanwhile the campaign had opened favourably for Otho, at whose bidding the armies of Dalmatia and Pannonia had begun to move. These comprised 4 legions, from each of which 2,000 troops were sent in advance. The 7th had been raised by Galba. The 11th, 13th, and 14th were veteran soldiers, the 14th having particularly distinguished itself by quelling the revolt in Britain. Nero had added to their reputation by selecting them as his most efficient troops. This had made them long faithful to Nero, and kindled their zeal for Otho. But their self-confidence induced a tardiness of movement proportionate to their strength and solidity. The auxiliary infantry and cavalry moved in advance of the main body of the legions. The capital itself contributed no contemptible force, namely 5 praetorian cohorts, some troops of cavalry, and the 1st legion, and together with these 2,000 gladiators, a disreputable kind of auxiliaries, but employed throughout the civil wars even by strict disciplinarians. Annius Gallus was put at the head of this force, and was sent on with Vestricius Spurinna to occupy the banks of the Padus, the original plan of the campaign having fallen to the ground, now that Caecina, who they had hoped might have been kept within the limits of Gaul, had crossed the Alps. Otho himself was accompanied by some picked men of the bodyguard, with whom were the rest of the praetorian cohorts, the veteran troops from the praetorian camp, and a vast number of the levies raised from the fleet. No indolence or riot disgraced his march. He wore a cuirass of iron, and was to be seen in front of the standards, on foot, rough and negligent in dress, and utterly unlike what common report had pictured him. 212. Fortune seemed to smile on his efforts. Through his fleets, which commanded the sea, he held the greater part of Italy, even as far as where the chain of the maritime Alps begins. The task of attempting the passage of this chain, and advancing into the Provincia Narbonensis, he had entrusted to 3 generals, Suedius Clemens, Antonius Novellus, and Aemilius Pacensis. Pacensis, however, was put in irons by his insubordinate troops. Antonius possessed no kind of authority, and Clemens commanded only for popularity, and was as reckless in transgressing the good order of military discipline as he was eager to fight. One would not have thought that it was Italy, and the habitations of their native country, that they were passing through. They burnt, spoiled, and plundered, as if they were among the lands of the foreigner and the cities of a hostile people, and with all the more frightful effect as nowhere had there been made any provision against the danger. The fields were full of rural wealth, the houses stood with open doors, and the owners, as with their wives and children they came forth to meet the army, found themselves surrounded, in the midst of the security of peace, with all the horrors of war. Marius Maturus was then governing as procurator to the province of the maritime Alps. Raising the population, in which is no lack of able-bodied men, he resolved to drive back the Othonianists from the borders of his province, but the mountaineers were cut down and broken by the first charge, as might be expected of men who had been hastily collected, who were not familiar with camps or with regular command, who saw no glory in victory, no infamy in flight. 213. Exasperated by this conflict, the troops of Otho vented their rage on the town of Albintemilium. In the field indeed they had secured no plunder, their rustic adversaries were poor and their arms worthless, nor could they be taken prisoners, for they were swift of foot and knew the country well. But the rapacity of the troops glutted itself in the ruin of an innocent population. The horror of these acts was aggravated by a noble display of fortitude in a Ligurian woman. She had concealed her son, and when the soldiers, who believed that some money had been hidden with him, questioned her with torture as to where she was hiding him, she pointed to her bosom, and replied, "It is here that he is concealed." Nor could any subsequent threats, or even death itself, make her falter in this courageous and noble answer. 2.14. Messengers now came in haste and alarmed to inform Fabius Valens how Otho's fleet was threatening the province of Gallia Narbonensis, which had sworn allegiance to Vitellius. Envoys from the colonies were already on the spot praying for aid. He dispatched 2 cohorts of Tungrian infantry, 4 squadrons of horse, and all the cavalry of the Treveri under the command of Julius Classicus. Part of these troops were retained for the defence of the colony of Forum Julii, for it was feared that if the whole army were sent by the route through the interior, the enemy's fleet might make a rapid movement on the unprotected coast. 12 squadrons of cavalry and some picked infantry advanced against the enemy. They were reinforced by a cohort of Ligurians, an auxiliary local force of long standing, and 500 Pannonians, not yet regularly enrolled. The conflict commenced without delay, the enemy's line of battle being so arranged that part of the levies from the fleet, who had a number of rustics among their ranks, were posted on the slope of the hills which border on the coast, the praetorians fully occupying the level ground between the hills and the shore, while on the sea was the fleet, moored to the land and ready for action, drawn up in line so as to present a formidable front. The Vitellianists, whose infantry was inferior, but who were strong in cavalry, stationed the mountaineers on the neighbouring heights, and their infantry in close ranks behind the cavalry. The squadrons of the Treveri charged the enemy incautiously, and found themselves encountered in front by the veteran troops, while on the flanks they were also annoyed by showers of stones from the rustic band, who were skilful throwers, and who, mixed up as they were among the regular soldiers, whether cowardly or brave, were all equally bold in the moment of victory. The general consternation of the Vitellianists were increased by a new alarm as the fleet attacked the rear of the combatants. By this movement they were hemmed in on all sides, and the whole force would have perished, had not the shades of night checked the advance of the victorious army, and covered the retreat of the vanquished. 2.15. The Vitellianists, however, though beaten, did not remain inactive. They brought up reinforcements and attacked the enemy, who felt themselves secure, and whose vigilance was relaxed by success. The sentinels were cut down, the camp stormed, and the panic reached the ships, till, as the alarm gradually subsided, they again assumed the offensive under the protection of some neighbouring heights which they had occupied. A terrible slaughter ensued, and the prefects of the Tungrian cohorts, after having long maintained their line unbroken, fell beneath a shower of missiles. The Othonianists, however, did not achieve a bloodless victory, as the enemy's cavalry wheeled round and cut off some who had impudently prolonged the pursuit, and then, as if a sort of armistice had been concluded to provide against any sudden panic that the cavalry of the one party or the fleet of the other might cause, the Vitellianists retreated to Antipolis, a town of Gallia Narbonensis, the Othonianists to Albigonum, in Upper Liguria. 2.16. Corsica, Sardinia, and the other islands of the neighbouring seas were retained in the interests of Otho by the fame of these naval successes. Corsica, however, all but suffered fatal injury from the rash proceedings of Decimus Pacarius, the procurator, proceedings which in so gigantic a war could contribute nothing to the general result, and which only brought destruction upon their author. In his hatred of Otho he resolved to support Vitellius with the whole strength of Corsica, an insignificant assistance even had the design succeeded. He collected the chief men of the island and explained his plans. Claudius Pyrrhus, captain of the Liburnian ships stationed in the place, and Quintius Sertus, a Roman knight, who ventured to offer opposition, he ordered to execution. All who were present were terrified at their death, and with the ignorant populace, which ever blindly shares in the fears of others, took the oath of allegiance to Vitellius. But when Pacarius began to enlist troops, and to weary with military duties an undisciplined population, disgusted with the unusual toil, they began to reflect upon their own weakness. The country which we inhabit, they said to themselves, is an island. Germany and its mighty legions are far from us, and we know that even countries protected by infantry and cavalry have been plundered and ravaged by the fleet. Their feelings underwent a sudden change. They did not, however, resort to open violence, but chose an opportunity for a treacherous attack. When the persons who usually surrounded Pacarius had left him, and he was naked and helpless in the bath, they slew him. His associates were slaughtered with him. The perpetrators of the deed carried the heads of the slain to Otho, as being the heads of public enemies, but lost among the crowd of greater criminals, in the vast confusion of events, they were neither rewarded by Otho nor punished by Vitellius. 2.17. Silius's horse had now, as I have already related, opened the way into Italy, and transferred the war across the borders. No one entertained any attachment to Otho, yet it was not because they preferred Vitellius. Long years of peace had subdued them to any kind of servitude, had made them ready to submit to the first comer and careless about the better cause. The wealthiest district of Italy, the broad plains and cities which lie between the Padus and the Alps, was now held by the troops of Vitellius, for by this time the infantry sent in advance by Caecina had also arrived. A cohort of Pannonians had been taken prisoner at Cremona, 100 cavalry and 1000 of the levies from the fleet intercepted between Placentia and Ticinum. Elated by these successes, the troops of Vitellius would no longer be restrained by the boundaries of the river's bank. The very sight of the Padus excited the men from Batavia and the Trans Rhenane provinces. Crossing the stream by a sudden movement, they advanced on Placentia, and seizing some of the reconnoitrers, so terrified the rest, that, deceived by their alarm, they announced that the whole army of Caecina was at hand. 2.18. Spurinna, who now held Placentia, was sure that Caecina had not yet arrived, and that even were he approaching, he ought to keep his men within their fortifications, and not confront a veteran army with 3 praetorian cohorts, 1000 veterans, and a handful of cavalry. But the undisciplined and inexperienced soldiery seized their standards and colours, and rushed to the attack, brandishing their weapons in the face of their general when he sought to restrain them, and spurning from them the tribunes and centurions, and even crying out that Otho was betrayed and that Caecina had come by invitation. Spurinna associated himself with the rash movement which others had originated, at first acting under compulsion, but afterwards pretending to consent, in the hope that his counsels might have more influence should the mutinous spirit abate. 2.19. When the Padus was in sight and night began to fall, they judged it expedient to entrench a camp. The labour, new as it was to the soldiery of the capital, broke their spirits. All the oldest among them began to inveigh against their own credulity, and to point out the difficulty and danger of their position, if on those open plains Caecina and his army were to surround their scanty forces. By this time more temperate language was heard throughout the camp, and the tribunes and centurions, mixing with the troops, suggested commendations of the prudence of their general in selecting for the rallying point and basis of his operations a colony rich in military strength and resources. Finally, Spurinna himself, not so much reproaching them with their error as exposing it by his arguments, conducted them all back to Placentia, except some scouts whom he left in a less turbulent temper and more amenable to command. The walls were strengthened, battlements were added, and the towers were raised in height. It was not only of the implements of war that provision and preparation were made, but of the spirit of subordination and the love of obedience. This was all that was wanting to the party, for they had no reason to be dissatisfied with their courage. End of Book 2, Part 1. Recording by Morgan Scorpion.